The word serviceable was the first thing anyone called Wren Calloway that morning, and she heard it through a half-inch gap in her father's study door, where she had gone to bring tea no one had asked for and stayed to hear what no one meant her to. She did not gasp. She did not step back. She did not let the floorboard creak beneath her boot, though the tray in her hands had begun, very slightly, to tremble. Larkspur Hall had been dying by inches for 11 years, and that November it seemed to exhale its last decent breath along with the frost, so that even the ivy on the east wall looked as though it had given up trying to hold the stone together. Serviceable, she turned the word over the way she turned over a coin to check it wasn't clipped, looking for the truer meaning beneath the polite one, and found it easily enough, because the man who had said it was not in the habit of dressing his opinions in anything softer than necessity. Not pretty. Not accomplished. Not, in any way that mattered to the ledgers being discussed on the other side of that door, a woman at all, but an asset with a bloodline attached, sound enough in build and disposition to be handed across a table like a bolt of decent, unremarkable cloth. The voice belonged to a solicitor she did not know, retained by a man she had not yet met, and the answer came from her own uncle, warm as a hearth fire and twice as false. "Clever girl," her uncle said. "My clever girl. She'll do very well. She's not the sort to make a fuss." He said it the way he said everything meant to bind her hands while sounding like praise, and the pressure underneath the words was not affection at all, though it wore affection's coat so well that she had spent a lifetime failing to tell the difference until it was far too late to matter. Her father said nothing. That, more than anything spoken aloud, was the sound she carried away from the door and up the narrow back stairs to the small, cold room that had been hers since her mother died. The sound of a good man's silence standing in for consent he did not have the strength left to withhold. Baron Edmund Calloway had not slept through a full night in 4 months, not since the auditors came from Corvain with their careful questions about a mining venture that had collapsed and taken half the county's savings down with it, a venture his own brother had structured, signed, and quietly bled dry, while letting his elder brother's name sit at the top of every document that mattered. Forgery was an ugly word, and the family had not yet said it aloud, but Wren had read the papers spread across her father's desk in the small hours when she could not sleep either, had recognized her uncle's hand disguised beneath her father's signature with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years learning to read handwriting the way other girls learned to read music, and had said nothing, because saying it would have meant accusing a man who fed her and being believed by no one who mattered. A baron facing ruin over a debt he had not personally incurred could still, in the right hands, be made to disappear quietly rather than publicly, provided someone with sufficient rank and sufficient discretion was willing to make the debt vanish, and provided that baron had something worth exchanging for the favor. He had, it turned out, exactly one thing of value left to trade, and she had grown up in this house long enough to know precisely what it was, because she had heard herself priced before, in smaller rooms by smaller people, and had simply never before heard the sum spoken so plainly. Not thunder. No portrait crashed from the wall to underscore the moment, no curtain fell, no one in the house so much as raised their voice. The clock in the hall struck 10, the same as it struck every morning, indifferent to the fact that a girl on the stairs had just learned the exact figure of her own worth and found it smaller than she had hoped and larger, somehow, than she had feared. She went on to the kitchen and set down the tea, untouched, and began mending a torn hem for the housemaid Sarah, because the girl could not afford a new gown for her sister's wedding, and Wren, whatever else she lacked, had a needle and 2 steady hands, a small crisis quietly averted that no one in the house would ever know to thank her for, which was, by then, entirely familiar. No one saw. That too was familiar, and had been since the year her mother died, the year Wren had learned to fold her usefulness into corners where it would not be noticed enough to be resented. Around her throat, on a ribbon gone soft with age, hung a plain brass thimble, dented on one side, the gilt long since worn to bare metal at the crown where a thumb had pressed it thousands of times before hers ever had. It was not fine. It had never been fine, not even when it was new, and beside the jewels the other women of the county wore to church it looked like exactly what it was. A poor woman's tool, salvaged from a life that had ended too early. Her mother, Alira Calloway, had pressed it into her palm during the last week she was well enough to sit upright in the light by the window, guiding Wren's small hands through the same 6 stitches over and over, with a patience that never once curdled into impatience, though her strength was failing by the hour. A seam mends stronger than the cloth ever was, her mother used to say. If you have the patience to make it small enough that no one sees where it broke, and Wren had not understood it then, had thought it only sewing advice, the way children mistake their parents' hardest-won truths for simple household instruction, and had only come to understand, slowly, over the years since, that her mother had been teaching her something else entirely, a way to survive being underestimated by becoming so quietly, thoroughly competent that the world's contempt could never quite reach the parts of her that mattered. She wore the thimble the way other women wore rings, though no one at Larkspur Hall had remarked on it in years, and the housemaid Sarah, drying her eyes over the mended hem, was the only person in the house who ever thought to say it suited her, which was, in its way, the kindest thing anyone had said to Wren Calloway in longer than she cared to count, and kindness, in that house, had become startling enough to be worth remembering exactly where and when it happened. It was 2 days later that her father called her into the study himself and told her, in a voice scraped thin by shame, that a man named Alaric Vane, Duke of Renwick, had offered to settle the family's obligations in full, quash the inquiry before it reached the criminal courts, and restore the Calloway name to whatever standing it could still claim, in exchange for her hand in marriage, and that the offer had already, without her knowledge or her consent, been accepted. He did not meet her eyes when he said it. She noted that with the same flat, cataloging attention she gave to torn hymns and unpaid accounts, filing it away as evidence rather than allowing herself, yet to feel it as wound. Every daughter in the kingdom understood, without ever being told outright, that her name and her person were currency the moment her father's fortunes required spending them. Every good marriage in the county had been arranged by men in studies not unlike this one, over sums not unlike this one, dressed up afterward in the language of affection, so that no one would have to look too closely at the transaction underneath. Every girl raised to be agreeable learned, sooner or later, exactly how far her agreeableness was expected to stretch, and Wren had simply never expected the demonstration to arrive with a title attached and a wedding date already fixed for the spring. She did not weep in front of her father, not because she felt nothing, but because she had decided, somewhere on the stairs 2 days earlier, that whatever else this marriage cost her, it would not cost her the last of her composure in front of the man who had traded it away. She asked only one question, which was whether the Duke of Renwick knew anything at all about the woman he had purchased, and her father, unable to answer, looked at his hands instead, which was answer enough. The name Renwick meant little to her beyond what everyone in the county knew, which was that the Duke was young for his rank, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, feared more than liked among men who did business with him, and rumored, in the particular hushed way rumor attaches itself to power, to have buried something of himself along with a mother who had died when he was a boy and a father whose cruelty the servants still spoke of in lowered voices decades later. She resolved to know more before she was made to stand beside him in a church, and resolved, in the same private breath, that whatever he turned out to be, she would not give him the satisfaction of watching her break over an arrangement she had never been permitted to refuse, a resolve that felt, in that cold study with its smell of old paper and older guilt, less like hope and more like the only weapon left in her possession. The wedding itself, when it came in the second week of the new year, was a small, correct, entirely bloodless affair, conducted with the efficient courtesy of men settling an account rather than men witnessing a joining of hearts, and afterward there was a ball, because a duke could not marry, however quietly he might have preferred to, without the county expecting a spectacle to confirm it. The Aldergate assembly rooms in Corvain had been dressed for the occasion in white and gold, candlelight multiplied 100-fold in mirrors, polished to a high, merciless shine, and the whole glittering machinery of society turned out to look at the bride the way one looks at a curious purchase displayed for the first time, appraising rather than admiring. She wore gray. It was not fashionable, and she had not chosen it for fashion. It was the one gown left to her that had been her mother's, remade twice to fit, unadorned by a single jewel, because the Calloway jewels, what few there had been, had gone to settle debts years before the Duke's money ever arrived to settle the rest. Beside the sapphires and the silk in every shade of celebration around her, the gray read as exactly what it was, a refusal dressed up as modesty, and she felt every eye in the room measure the gap between what a duchess was meant to look like and what had, instead, been delivered. It was Lady Marguerite Sutcliffe who found her first, gliding across the floor in blue silk, the precise shade of a cold morning sky, beautiful in the effortless, weaponized way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her without her ever seeming to try, and she took Wren's hands in both of hers with every appearance of warmth. "How brave of you," she said, "to wear something so unassuming on a night when everyone will be looking." The words sounded like a compliment. The pressure beneath them was not, and every woman near enough to hear understood exactly what had been said, which was that Wren Calloway had not thought herself worth dressing for, or had not been able to afford to, and either reading served Lady Marguerite's purposes equally well. It was not a question, though Wren answered it as though it had been. "How kind of you to notice," she said, "when everyone else is far too occupied admiring you to notice anyone at all," which sounded, on its surface, like humility, and landed, beneath the surface, exactly where she intended it to land. A small blade turned back along its own edge, so that the room's soft laughter, when it came at Lady Marguerite's expense rather than hers, not universal laughter. But enough. Lady Marguerite's smile did not slip, quite, but something behind her eyes recalculated, and Wren understood, with the flat clarity of someone cataloging a new and permanent enemy, that she had just made one, and that the making of it would cost her later in ways she could not yet predict. It was the Dowager, Lady Prisca Vane, aunt to the Duke by marriage and mistress of Renwick Court's Manors for 3 decades before Wren's arrival, who delivered the evening's second and crueler blow, and delivered it with the particular relish of a woman who believed cruelty, properly phrased, was simply concern wearing its best clothes. "Is everything quite all right, my dear?" she asked, loudly enough for the nearest dozen guests to hear and softly enough to pretend otherwise. "There have been such stories about the Calloway situation. One does hope your husband knows precisely what he has taken on. One so admires a man willing to be generous to those who cannot help themselves." The room did not laugh this time. It did something worse, which was to go very quiet, the particular hush of people leaning in to watch a wound being opened in public, breath held, fans stilled, 100 small private satisfactions gathering like static before a storm. Ren felt the heat rise up the back of her neck, felt her pulse climb, and did not let a single muscle in her face confirm that any of it had landed. There was a great deal she might have said in that moment, a dozen precise and devastating truths about debts not her own, and a husband not of her choosing, and an old woman's cruelty dressed up as gentility, and she catalogued every one of them in the space of a breath, and set every one of them down unused, because giving Lady Prisca the satisfaction of a visible wound would have cost more than. The silence did. "I hope so too," she said instead, very evenly. "My husband has always struck me as a man who knows precisely what he is doing, and let the dowager work out for herself whether that had been agreement or warning." No thunder followed. No chandelier swayed loose from the ceiling to underscore the moment's cruelty. The small orchestra in the corner, after the barest hesitation, simply began the next set, and the room, with the terrible resilience of rooms accustomed to swallowing small cruelties whole, resumed its bright noise as though nothing at all had happened. Because nothing, by its own accounting, had. It was only later, once the dancing had reclaimed the floor, and the worst of the watching eyes had drifted elsewhere in search of fresher amusement, that Ren allowed herself the single indulgence of standing very still near a tall window at the edge of the room, unnoticed the way she had trained herself to be unnoticed her whole life, and let the evening's accumulated weight settle somewhere behind her ribs where no one could see it land. That was where he found her, though she did not yet know, in that first unguarded moment, that she had been found at all. She became aware of him first as a stillness at the edge of her vision, the particular kind of stillness that made the surrounding noise seem, by comparison, slightly too loud, and when she turned her head, she discovered the Duke of Renwick watching her with an attention so quiet and so complete that it took her a full second to understand it was not disapproval. He was not a tall man in any way that announced itself, but he had the trick, common to men accustomed to being obeyed, of occupying more of a room than his actual size accounted for, and his eyes, dark and very still, gave away nothing at all of what lay behind them. "I did not think," he said, and his voice was quiet in a way that never seemed to require raising, that a woman could stand at the edge of a ballroom being dismantled in front of 200 witnesses and answer with a compliment sharp enough to draw blood without anyone in the room noticing the blade. She had not expected him to have heard the exchange with Lady Prisca at all, let alone to have understood it so precisely, and she felt something in her chest tighten, and then, deliberately. "Release, I did not think," she answered, "that a duke would trouble himself to notice how his wife defends herself, when he might simply enjoy the performance from a comfortable distance, and watched, with an interest she would not have admitted to anyone, for how the barb landed." It did not make him flinch. It made, instead, the faintest suggestion of something at the corner of his mouth. Gone again almost before she could be certain she had seen it, and he said only, "I find I am rarely comfortable at a distance from anything I intend to understand," which was not, by any measure she could take, the answer of a man who considered her merely a serviceable arrangement, concluded and filed away. It was not admiration, not yet, but it was recognition. And recognition, she was beginning to understand, was a rarer and more dangerous gift than admiration had ever been. He did not linger. A duke could not be seen lingering at his own wedding ball with the wife he had, by every account the county cared to circulate, purchased rather than chosen, and he excused himself within the minute to attend to some obligation of rank that plainly bored him, leaving her at the window with the peculiar sensation of having been, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually seen by someone whose seeing carried weight. She did not examine that sensation too closely that night. There was too much else to survive first, too many curtsies to make and too many smiles to hold in place, and it was well past midnight before the carriage finally returned her to Renwick Court, cold and glittering under a sky scrubbed clean of cloud, where she climbed the wide stone stairs alone, her new husband having stayed behind to see the last of the guests away, and sat for a long while by the fire in a bedroom too grand for the plain wooden trunk she had brought with her, turning the brass thimble at her throat between two fingers, thinking not of the marriage or the money or her father's restored name, but of the particular quality of a man's attention when it did not ask anything of her in return. In the weeks that followed, the household at Renwick Court arranged itself around her with the careful, watchful courtesy people extend to something they have not yet decided how to classify. Servants deferential but uncertain, the dowager coolly correct in public, and pointedly absent from anywhere Wren might have needed guidance. Lady Marguerite, a frequent and unwelcome visitor, whose calls always seemed to coincide with moments Wren least wished to be observed. The Duke kept to his own hours and his own rooms, courteous at table, exacting in every small domestic matter that crossed his desk, and otherwise so contained that she began to suspect his composure was not merely a habit of rank, but a wall built, brick by careful brick, around something he had long ago decided the world did not deserve to see. She did not press against it. She had walls of her own, after all, and understood, better than most, the particular exhaustion of having them tested by people who mistook curiosity for kindness. It was in the estate's account books, 3 weeks into the marriage, that she found her first real foothold with him, a set of ledgers so badly kept by an aging steward that a full quarter's rents had gone unaccounted for, and rather than bring the error to anyone's attention the way a decorative duchess might have been expected to, wringing her hands and waiting for a man to fix it, she simply fixed it herself over 4 quiet evenings, cross-referencing figures by candlelight with the same patient, invisible competence she had once brought to Tornham's, and left the corrected ledger on his desk without comment, unsigned, expecting nothing. He found her the following morning in the small breakfast room reserved for family rather than guests, the ledger under his arm, and set it down beside her plate with a silence that stretched half a minute before he spoke. "This is not the hand of a woman with nothing to occupy her," he said, and it was not quite a question, though she answered it as though it were. "I have always found idle hands make poor company," she said, and watched him consider that, turning it over the way she had once watched her mother turn over a coin, and something in his stillness shifted. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a recalculation, the particular quiet of a man revising an assumption he had not realized he was making. It became, after that morning, a kind of unspoken arrangement between them, small tasks left for her without explanation, and returned without comment, a tenant dispute she resolved with more tact than his steward had managed in a decade, a household expense she caught before it became an embarrassment at his bank. Each small competence noted by him in silence and answered by her in the same coin, and though neither of them named what was accumulating between those quiet exchanges, she found herself, some evenings, listening for his step in the corridor with an attentiveness she would not yet admit to feeling. Lady Marguerite noticed it before Wren did, or claimed to, arriving one afternoon in a gown the color of ripe plums to find the Duke and his wife bent together over a map of the eastern boundary, heads close, voices low, and remarking afterward, with a laugh pitched to Carrie, how touching it was that a man so particular about his time could spare so much of it for household accounts. One so rarely sees a duke made useful. The words sounded like admiration for his generosity. The intent beneath them was to remind everyone present, Wren most of all, that a duke's attention was a finite resource, and that every hour spent on ledgers and tenant disputes was an hour not spent on the woman the county had always assumed he would eventually marry instead. Wren said nothing in her own defense. The Duke, to her genuine surprise, said it for her, observing, in a voice gone very dry and very quiet, that he had found household accounts a good deal more honest than most conversation, which drew a ripple of laughter that was not, this time, at Wren's expense, and left Lady Marguerite's smile fixed a half-second too long in place before she recovered it. It was the first time he had defended her in front of witnesses, and though he did it with no more warmth than he might have corrected a misquoted figure, she felt the gesture land somewhere she had not expected to still have feeling, and understood, with the particular dread of someone recognizing a danger she could not yet afford to name. That being noticed by a man like Alaric Vane was not a comfort but a complication, one that would only deepen the longer she let herself want it. She did not yet want it, she told herself, standing at her window that evening with the thimble cool against her palm, watching the last light drain out of a sky the color of an old bruise over the eastern hills. But she recognized, even as she told herself so, that the sentence had already stopped being entirely true, and that recognition, quiet and unwelcome as an early frost, settled itself into the room and did not leave with the dark. The weeks that followed folded one into another with the deceptive gentleness of a season pretending toward spring before it was ready to commit to it. And Wren found the rhythm of Renwick Court settling around her the way a garment settles once it has finally been properly taken in, tight in places she had expected ease and unexpectedly comfortable in places she had braced for chafing. She and the Duke had fallen into a habit of evenings in the small library off the East Gallery, ostensibly to review whatever household matter had accumulated through the day, and increasingly for no better reason than that neither of them seemed inclined to end the conversation once it began. He asked her opinion on tenant disputes he could easily have settled himself, and she came to understand, slowly, that the asking was not laziness, but a kind of test he had stopped bothering to disguise, a way of learning what she thought before he told her what he intended. "You have opinions about everything," he observed one evening, not quite a complaint, watching her annotate a rent schedule with the same unhurried precision she brought to a Tornham, and she answered without looking up, "I have opinions about everything I am given the chance to know anything about," which is a smaller number of things than you might imagine, and watched him absorb that the way he absorbed most things she said to him now. In silence, filing it somewhere behind those unreadable eyes for later use. It was not admiration yet, she told herself, though she was beginning to suspect the word she was avoiding was closer than she wished to admit, and she had grown wary of examining the feeling too directly, the way one grows wary of pressing a bruise simply to confirm it still aches. The county had not stopped watching them. Of course, a duke who had purchased a wife to settle a debt was expected to behave like a man executing an arrangement, cool and correct and visibly uninterested, and every evening he chose instead to spend in her company. Every small courtesy he extended in front of witnesses was noted, weighed, and reported back to Lady Marguerite Sutcliffe with the diligence of an accounting ledger kept by people with entirely too much leisure. It was at a dinner given by the Ashcombe family in early March that Lady Marguerite made her clearest attempt yet to remind the room, and Wren, exactly where the boundaries of the Duke's obligation were meant to end. "How generous of you, Your Grace," she said, laying one gloved hand briefly on his sleeve in a gesture calibrated to look accidental to everyone but its intended audience. "To have taken such trouble over the Calloway situation, one does hope your kindness continues to be appreciated as it deserves." The words sounded like praise for his charity. The intent beneath them was to remind the table that whatever warmth had grown between the Duke and his wife was, in Lady Marguerite's telling, still charity, still condescension. Still a rich man's indulgence toward a poor relation he had been obliged to rescue. Wren felt the old catalogue of unsaid retorts assemble itself behind her teeth, sharp and satisfying and entirely unspoken, and she was midway through composing the humble, courteous answer that would relocate the insult back onto its author, when the Duke answered first, in a voice gone very quiet and very even. The voice she had learned by now to recognize as more dangerous than any raised one. "I find," he said, setting down his glass with a precision that drew every eye at the table, "that I have received a great deal more from this marriage than I gave to it, which makes generosity rather the wrong word for what you are describing, though I understand the confusion, since generosity is the only transaction your circles seem equipped to recognize." The silence that followed was not universal laughter this time. It was something closer to a held breath, a room recalculating what it had assumed it understood, and Lady Marguerite's composure slipped for the first time Wren had ever witnessed. A half-second falter before she recovered her smile and turned the conversation elsewhere with the practiced ease of a woman who had survived worse rooms than this one. Wren said nothing further, but she felt the words settle into her the way warmth settles into cold hands held too long over a fire, slow and almost painful in its arrival. And that night, walking back through the gallery toward her rooms, she found she could not stop turning his sentence over, receiving more than I gave, searching it for the ordinary courtesy a husband might extend, and finding, instead, something that read uncomfortably like truth. It was Duchess Ismay, the Duke's grandmother, and the last surviving voice of authority in the Vane family, older than the Dowager herself, who arrived at Renwick Court unannounced the following week in a carriage entirely too grand for the narrow country roads it had traveled, declaring to the assembled household that she had come to see for herself what sort of creature her grandson had gone and married, since no letter he troubled himself to write had told her anything worth knowing. She was a small, straight-backed woman with sharp eyes the same dark, unreadable brown as her grandson's, though hers gave away considerably more, and she took one look at Wren across the entrance hall, at the plain gray traveling dress and the brass thimble visible at her throat where a fashionable woman would have worn a jewel, and said, before anyone had thought to make introductions, "Well, at least he had the sense to marry someone who looks as though she could actually run a household instead of merely decorate one." It was not, by any ordinary measure, a compliment, and yet Wren felt something in her chest loosen at the bluntness of it, the sheer relief of being assessed honestly rather than politely. The old woman took her arm before the day was out and walked her twice around the garden in the cold March air, asking pointed questions about the estate accounts and the tenant disputes, and eventually, without any apparent transition, about her mother, and Wren found herself telling this near stranger about the thimble and the 6 stitches, and the aphorism about mending small before she had quite decided to share any of it at all. "A seam mends stronger than the cloth ever was," she said, repeating her mother's words for what felt like the first time she had spoken them aloud to anyone since the funeral, if you have the patience to make it small enough that no one sees where it broke. Duchess Ismay stopped walking entirely and looked at her for a long moment with an expression Wren could not immediately name, and said only, "Your mother sounds as though she understood something most people spend a lifetime failing to learn, which is that the mending matters more than whoever gets to see it," and then resumed walking as though she had not just handed Wren something she would carry for the rest of the visit like a coal held carefully against the cold. It was the old Duchess, too, who first noticed what no one else at Renwick Court had yet troubled themselves to notice, which was that her grandson watched his wife across every room they occupied together, with the particular helpless attention of a man who did not yet understand what he was looking at. and she said as much to Ren over tea one gray afternoon, with the plain satisfaction of a woman who enjoyed being right before anyone else caught up to her. "He has always been careful with his attention," she said. "Careful the way a man is careful with something he has been burned by before, and I have not seen him spend it so freely on anyone since he was a boy who still believed spending it was safe." Ren did not know what to say to that, and so said nothing at all, though she carried the observation with her the way she carried the thimble, close and constant and slightly too warm against her skin. The peace of that visit did not last. It was on the second week of April, with the old Duchess still in residence and the last of the winter finally loosening its grip on the county, that a letter arrived at Renwick Court, addressed not to the Duke, but to the Lord Chancellor's office in Corvain, a copy of which found its way, by means no one afterward could satisfactorily trace, into the hands of half the drawing rooms in the capital before the Duke himself had finished reading his own. The letter was unsigned. It alleged, in careful, damning, entirely plausible detail, that the original evidence used to clear Baron Edmund Calloway of complicity in the collapsed mining venture had itself been fabricated, that the documents exonerating him had been drafted and planted by his own daughter in the weeks before her marriage, with the full knowledge and encouragement of the man who was even then negotiating to make her his wife, and that the Duke of Renwick, far from rescuing an innocent family from ruin, had knowingly participated in obstructing a criminal inquiry in exchange for a bride he found convenient. It was not merely a social embarrassment. A duke about to be confirmed to a seat on the Crown's Commission for Northern Trade could not survive even the suggestion of having obstructed a fraud inquiry for personal gain. The appointment, 3 years in the careful building, would collapse within the week if the allegation was believed. And Baron Edmund, whatever protection the original settlement had purchased him, would find himself facing not disgrace but prosecution, this time with his own daughter named as a co-conspirator rather than a victim. The household that had, for weeks, arranged itself carefully around the fragile new warmth between the Duke and his wife now arranged itself, instead, around the crisis. Servants moving in hushed urgency, the Dowager Lady Priska making no effort whatsoever to hide her satisfaction at seeing confirmed, at last, what she had suspected from the beginning, that the Calloway girl had never been what she seemed. Lady Marguerite, when the news reached her, was reported to have said, with theatrical sorrow calibrated for maximum circulation, that she had always feared something of the sort, that a woman so quietly capable had always seemed, to her, a little too capable to be entirely trusted, words that sounded like reluctant concern and carried, beneath them, the precise cruelty of confirmation she had been waiting months to deliver. Ren read the letter herself, standing very still in the Duke's study with the paper trembling almost imperceptibly in her hands, and felt something colder than fear settle into her, the particular icy clarity of a person watching her own careful mending come undone in public. It was not, in itself, the worst of it. The worst of it came that same evening, when the Duke, drawn and gray with the day's accumulated weight, asked her directly, in a voice stripped of its usual dry warmth, whether there was any truth in it at all, whether she had known, whether she had used him. The question was fair. She understood, even as it cut her, that a man facing the ruin of everything he had built had every right to ask it, and understanding did nothing at all to soften the wound of hearing him ask it anyway, of watching, for one unbearable moment, the possibility of doubt move behind those unreadable eyes where she had only ever seen recognition before. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep, she told him, with a composure that cost her more than anything she had managed since the night she overheard herself called serviceable through a half-inch gap in a door, that she had told him the truth from the very first evening he asked her anything at all, and that if 11 weeks of watching her mend his household's small failures had not yet taught him the difference between her and a liar, then no denial she offered now would teach it to him either, and she left him standing alone in the study rather than beg to be believed by a man who was, in that moment, still deciding whether she deserved it. It was Duchess Ismay who found her afterward in the cold garden, in the dark, wrapped in nothing but a shawl too thin for the night air, and who did not ask a single question before declaring, with the flat certainty of a woman who had lived 70 years and trusted her own judgment above any document, that she did not believe a word of the letter and never would, whoever had written it, because she had watched Wren Calloway mend a torn hem for a housemaid who could not repay her, and had known. In that instant, everything that mattered about the girl's character, and no anonymous letter written by a coward too frightened to sign his own name, would ever outweigh that in her accounting. "Believe first and demand the proof after," she said, tapping her cane once against the frozen ground for emphasis. "That is how you tell the difference between people worth keeping and people merely worth managing." And Wren, cold and wounded and grateful beyond anything she had words for, found in that blunt, unconditional faith the first solid ground she had stood on all day. It was the two of them together, grandmother and granddaughter by marriage, who sat up past 2 a.m. by lamplight in the old Duchess's rooms, spreading the letter and its accompanying documents across the writing table like physicians examining a wound. And it was Wren, whose eyes had spent a lifetime learning the particular geography of paper and ink and the small betraying habits of a familiar hand, who found it first. The enclosed exhibit, presented as a copy of the original exonerating evidence, bore her father's signature and a date from the previous autumn, months before the marriage had ever been proposed, meant to prove the fraud had been planned well in advance. But the paper itself, when held to the lamp, carried a watermark from a mill in the eastern county that Wren recognized instantly, because her father's steward had complained bitterly, not 4 months earlier, about being forced to switch suppliers after the old mill burned to the ground the previous winter, meaning the paper in her hands could not possibly have existed on the date it claimed to bear. "There it is," she said, very quietly, setting the page down with the careful precision of a woman handling something that might yet cut her, and felt the cold clarity of certainty settle where dread had been sitting all evening. The mill did not exist in autumn. This paper was made after the new year, which means whoever forged this exhibit knew the venture's collapse in detail and knew my father's hand well enough to copy it convincingly, but did not know or did not think to check when the paper beneath his own pen had actually been milled. Duchess Ismay's eyes went very sharp and very pleased. The look of a woman watching a theory she had trusted from the start finally produce its proof, and she said only, "Well then, we know precisely one thing now that we did not know this morning, which is that whoever wrote this letter is either a fool or badly served by his stationer, and I have never yet met a man clever enough to forge a signature who was also careless enough to overlook his paper, which means someone closer to your father than a stranger did this." Wren did not need the rest of the night to work out who she had known, somewhere beneath the part of her that wanted very badly not to know it, from the moment she read the first line of the letter, that only one person alive had both the skill to copy her father's hand convincingly and the motive to want the settlement unraveled, and that was her uncle, Reginald Calloway, whose own debts, she would later learn, had grown desperate enough in the months since the original scandal that he had convinced himself a fresh crisis, properly managed, might yet be turned to further profit at his brother's expense. The confrontation, when it came 2 days later in the Duke's study with the Duke himself present and gray-faced and silent, was neither long nor dignified. "Reginald," presented with the mill records and the dated correspondence that placed the paper's manufacture squarely after the new year, attempted first denial, then indignation. Then, when Duchess Ismay produced a letter in his own hand from years earlier, whose phrasing matched, almost word for word, a turn of speech in the anonymous accusation, collapsed into a silence far more damning than any confession could have been. He left Renwick Court that same afternoon, and left the county entirely within the week, and the truth, once it began to circulate, moved through Corvain with the same speed and thoroughness the lie had, so that within a fortnight, Baron Edmund Calloway's name stood, cleared not merely of complicity, but of every shadow that had clung to it since the venture's collapse. And the Duke's commission proceeded, in the end, without a day's further delay. It should have felt like victory. Wren found, instead, standing at her window on the evening, the last of the gossip finally turned in her favor, that she felt something closer to exhaustion, and beneath the exhaustion, something harder and colder that she recognized, with some reluctance, as grief, not for anything lost in the scandal itself, but for the single unbearable moment in the study when the man she had begun, against every intention, to trust, had looked at her and asked whether she had used him. He had apologized for it since, more than once, in the careful, formal language of a man unused to admitting fault, and she had accepted the apology because refusing it would have served no purpose beyond cruelty. But acceptance and forgetting were not the same transaction, and she found she could not simply resume the easy evenings in the library as though the question had never been asked at all. A marriage that had begun as a debt settled between men was, she was coming to understand with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, still capable of behaving like exactly that at the moment it mattered most, however many quiet evenings of shared ledgers had made it feel, in the months between, like something closer to a choice. She admitted to herself only in the privacy of the coldest hour of the night, to be chosen outright, deliberately, without the shadow of obligation or rescue anywhere in the choosing, and she did not know how a woman went about asking for that from a man who had, however gently, however sincerely he had come to regret it, still doubted her the one time doubting her had truly cost something. It was her old friend Josephine Aldercott, arriving for a brief visit from the neighboring county in the last week of April, and finding Wren quieter than she had ever known her to be, who said the thing Wren had not permitted herself to say even in her own head. "You are going to leave, aren't you?" Josephine said, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. Watching Wren fold linens with more attention than the task required, and when Wren did not immediately deny it, Josephine only nodded, unsurprised, and added, with the particular gentle bluntness of an old friend who had earned the right to it, "You love him, Wren. Anyone with eyes can see it, and that is precisely why you cannot stay here pretending to be grateful for a marriage he has to prove. All over again, that he actually wants, because gratitude and love are not the same current, and you of all people have never mistaken one useful thing for another." She left within the hour, on some errand she did not name, and Wren stood alone in the linen room turning the sentence over long after the sound of Josephine's carriage had faded down the drive, until the decision that had been assembling itself somewhere beneath her ribs for days finally arrived at its full and undeniable shape. She left Renwick Court 3 mornings later, before the household had fully woken, taking only the small wooden trunk she had brought as a bride and the brass thimble at her throat, leaving behind a letter for the Duke that said, in the fewest words she could manage, that she was grateful for his defense and his honesty and his eventual apology, but that she could not remain in a house waiting to discover, over and over, whether he would choose her freely the next time doubt was offered to him cheaply, and that if he ever wished to know her answer to that question, He would have to come and ask it somewhere she had chosen rather than somewhere he had bought. The Duke returned from 3 days in Corvain, where the final formalities of his commission had at last been settled, to a house gone suddenly, unbearably quiet, and to a letter waiting on his study desk in handwriting he had learned, these past months, to recognize before he even broke the seal. And Duchess Ismay, watching her grandson read it standing very still by the cold hearth, said nothing at all beyond observing, once he had lowered the page, that a man who had spent a lifetime being careful with his attention now had exactly one chance left to spend it recklessly, and that the roads to Larkspur Hall, by the look of the sky gathering low and black over the eastern hills, would not stay passable for very much longer. The storm broke over the eastern hills before he had covered half the distance, rain coming down in hard silver sheets that turned the road to Larkspur Hall into a treacherous ribbon of mud. And the Duke of Renwick rode through it without slowing, because he had spent 11 weeks learning what it cost a person to wait for something they were not certain would ever come. And he did not intend to make Wren Calloway wait 1 hour longer than the roads themselves required. It was near 2 in the morning when he finally reached the house, dark against a darker sky except for a single lit window on the ground floor, and he stood for a moment in the flooding dooryard before he knocked, rain sluicing off him in ropes, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely unprotected by his own rank, no title, no commission, no careful composure left dry enough to shelter under. Sarah, the housemaid whose torn hem Wren had once mended without being asked, opened the door with a candle guttering in the draught, and did not seem at all surprised to find a Duke standing soaked to the skin on the step at 2 in the morning, only stood aside and said quietly that the mistress was in the small parlor where the fire still held. He crossed the threshold, and the old house seemed to gather itself around the moment the way a room gathers before a verdict, the hall clock ticking too loudly in the sudden hush, and he found her exactly where he had somehow known he would find her, seated by a low fire in the same plain gray she had worn to her own wedding ball, the brass thimble catching the firelight at her throat. A needle and a torn cuff forgotten in her lap as though she had stopped mending some time ago and simply never moved. She did not rise when he entered. She looked at him for a long moment across the small room, rain still dripping from his coat onto her mother's worn carpet, and said nothing at all, which he understood immediately to be its own kind of answer, a door left neither open nor closed, and he found he would have to earn every step of the distance between them rather than assume it. He stopped just inside the doorway first and did not move closer, and said quietly that he had read her letter 40 times on the ride from Renwick Court, and had not, in all 40 readings, found a single word in it he could honestly call unfair. She did not answer that either, only watched him, and he crossed half the room to the edge of the worn hearthrug and stopped again, because he understood, without being told, that this was not a distance to be closed all at once. "I did not come tonight," he said, "because a duke cannot afford the scandal of a runaway wife, though God knows there are men in Corvain who would tell you that is precisely what should have brought me. I did not come because my grandmother informed me, in terms considerably less gentle than she generally troubles herself to use with me, that I would regret it the rest of my life if I let the storm decide this instead of riding through it. I did not come because the commission requires a wife whose name carries no shadow, though it certainly does, and though God knows I have spent enough of my life being careful about what carries my name and what does not." He crossed the last of the distance then, slowly, until he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his eyes, and his voice, when he spoke again, had lost every trace of the dry, contained authority she had first met at a ballroom window months before, until what remained was simply a man, stripped of his rank the way the storm had stripped him of his dry coat, entirely without shelter. "I came," he said, "because the house has been unbearably quiet since you left it, and I discovered I did not know how to want anything in it the way I had wanted, without ever admitting it to myself, simply the sound of you somewhere in the next room. It was not admiration that brought me here tonight, and it was not gratitude, and it was not obligation, though I have felt all three of those things toward you, and been too great a coward to say so plainly, until a storm and an empty house finally shamed me into it. I came because I wish it. Not because your father's name needed saving twice over, not because the commission demanded a wife above reproach, not because my grandmother would never have forgiven me for losing you, but because when I imagine every version of my life from this night forward, the only one I can bear is the one where you are in it, chosen, freely, by a man with no ledger left to settle and no debt left to discharge, wanting you simply because I wish it. And because I have never in my life wished for anything so completely as I wish, standing here, for you to let me stay." She did not answer immediately, though she felt the old catalogue of things she might have said assemble itself, and, for once, found she did not want to use any of them as a blade. There was a long silence in which the fire cracked and the rain beat against the windows, and neither of them moved, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady in the particular way that cost her everything to keep steady. "You asked me once," she said, "whether I had used you, and I have thought of little else these 3 weeks besides how that single question undid 11 weeks of ledgers and evenings and every small kindness I had let myself believe was real. I do not doubt now that you regret asking it. I do not doubt that you rode through a storm to say so, but I spent my whole life being wanted only for what use I could be made to serve, and I will not trade that for a marriage where I am wanted only until the next accusation makes wanting me inconvenient, however sincerely you mean it tonight. If you have come to reclaim a bargain, you may go home dry in the morning, and I will release you from it entirely, and no one will think less of either of us for it. But if you have come because you truly wish it, then you will have to prove that to me in more than one storm-soaked speech, however well constructed, because I have earned, at considerable cost, the right to be believed slowly rather than swept up quickly." It was not a rejection, and he understood that, standing very still in the firelight, with rain still dripping from his sleeves, though it was also, unmistakably, not yet a surrender, and something in his face, watching her hold that line even now, even exhausted and cold and clearly aching for the same thing he was aching for, made him understand more completely than anything else she had ever said to him exactly what it was he had nearly lost. "Then let me start tonight," he said, "and prove it every day after, for as long as it takes you to believe it without reservation," and he did not reach for her hand so much as simply offer his own, open, unclaimed, and let it rest there in the space between them, asking nothing, demanding nothing, only waiting. She looked at his hand for a long moment, and then at his face, searching it the way she had once searched a forged document for the single anomaly that would tell her everything, and found, this time, nothing false in it at all, no calculation, no rank, only a man who had ridden through a flooding road at 2 a.m, because the alternative had become unbearable to him. She set the mended cuff aside and reached out and took his hand, and did not let go, and felt, in the moment their fingers closed together, something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 weeks finally, quietly, release. The tears that came then surprised her with their suddenness, though she did not turn away from him to hide them, because they did not feel like breaking, only like something true, finally finding its way to the surface after being pressed down so long it had nearly forgotten how to rise, and he did not try to stop them or rush her past them, only stood holding her hand in the firelight while the storm outside slowly spent itself against the old walls of Larkspur Hall, until the tears passed the way weather passes, leaving the air clearer for having fallen. Mend it small enough, she thought, hearing her mother's voice for the first time in months without the old ache attached to it, and no one will ever see where it broke, and understood, holding the Duke of Renwick's hand in her dead mother's parlor at 3 a.m, that some mendings were never meant to stay hidden at all, that some were meant to be shown, proudly, as proof the seam had held. It was some months later, once the last of that spring's mud had dried into the hard gold roads of early summer, that Wren Calloway, now fully and by every account happily the Duchess of Renwick, began the small project that would, in time, become the thing the county remembered her for longest. She had never forgotten the particular helplessness of being a girl with no trade and no fortune, valued only for what her marriage could purchase for someone else, and she had never forgotten, either, the quiet competence that had gone unseen and unrewarded for years, simply because no one had thought to look for it in a woman's hands. With the Duke's full backing and no small amount of Duchess Ismay's fierce enthusiasm, she converted the old dower house at the edge of the Renwick estate into a school, plain and unadorned in exactly the manner she preferred, where girls with no fortune and no prospects, tenant daughters and orphaned kitchen maids, and the overlooked younger sisters of men who would never think to educate them, were taught needlework of a quality fine enough to earn real wages, along with letters and figures enough to keep their own accounts and never again be entirely at the mercy of someone else's arithmetic. She called it, with a dry humor that made the Duke laugh outright the first time she said it aloud, the serviceable house, reclaiming the word that had once been used to diminish her and turning it, deliberately, into a banner. Because a thing that is truly serviceable, she told her first class of 11 girls on their opening morning, is a thing the world cannot survive without, however rarely it troubles itself to say so aloud. The doubters took longer to convert than the girls did. Lady Prisca called the enterprise an indulgence for 2 full seasons before she was seen, quite by accident, admiring a piece of embroidery worked by one of the school's first graduates, fine enough to rival anything from a London workshop, and found herself, some months later, quietly recommending the serviceable house's linens to acquaintances who had never once heard her recommend anything. With sincerity. Lady Marguerite Sutcliffe's influence, meanwhile, had been thinning steadily since the spring of the forged letter, not through any single dramatic reversal, but through the slow, unglamorous attrition of a society that had begun, gradually, to notice how often her wit had aimed itself at people with no power to answer it. Until she married, that autumn, a viscount from a distant county, and removed herself from Corvain's drawing rooms entirely, taking her weaponized charm to an audience that had not yet learned to see through it. The serviceable house grew, term by term, until it could no longer fit the old dower house, and it was in its 3rd autumn, on a bright, clear morning, after a week of hard rain had finally broken, that the county gathered on the lawn of Renwick Court itself for the opening of its new and much larger building, funded in equal part by the Duke's purse and by the sale of the school's own fine work, which had become, by then, sought after as far away as the capital. The crowd that morning was larger than anyone had expected. Tenant families and gentry alike, drawn by curiosity or genuine respect in roughly equal measure, gathered on the lawn beneath a sky scrubbed so clean by the departed storm that it seemed almost to have been polished for the occasion, and there was a hush that fell over all of it, the particular attentive quiet of a crowd that senses something worth remembering is about to be said. when the Duke of Renwick climbed the low wooden platform built for the occasion and turned to face them. He did not speak immediately. He looked, first, for a long moment, toward the edge of the crowd where Wren stood, plainly dressed as always, the brass thimble bright at her throat where she had pinned it, that morning, to the outside of her collar, rather than hidden beneath it, and something in his face, visible to everyone gathered close enough to see it, was unmistakably, undisguisedly proud. 3 years ago, he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried across the still lawn the way a voice carries when a crowd has stopped its own noise to make room for it. I married a woman this county had already decided it understood. She was, by the accounting of most rooms she entered that season, a debt paid rather than a bride chosen, useful enough to be tolerated, unremarkable enough to be overlooked, serviceable, and nothing more. He let the word sit there a moment, the same word that had once been whispered through a half-inch gap in a study door, and Wren, standing at the edge of the crowd with her hand very still at her side, felt every year of that word's weight rise and settle, and finally begin to lift. They were wrong, he said, and the words landed with the flat, unadorned force of a man who had spent a lifetime being careful with his speech, and had decided, on this one morning, to spend it recklessly instead. They were wrong to call her serviceable, as though usefulness were the whole of her worth, when she has spent every year since proving that her usefulness was never separate from her wisdom, or her patience, or the particular unflinching honesty that once told me, quite plainly, that I had not yet earned the right to be believed. They were wrong to overlook her in every room she ever stood at the edge of, because the truth this county has been far too slow to learn is that the edge of the room was very often the only place clear enough to actually see what mattered. And they were wrong, most of all, to imagine that a woman raised with nothing could not be the most valuable thing to happen to this house in a generation, because I stand here today, in front of every one of you who once measured her worth by her fortune, to tell you that she is the reason this estate has a future worth wanting at all. He paused and looked out over the assembled crowd, tenant and gentry alike, gone very still and very quiet, and finished, more simply than anything he had said before it, that every girl who walked through the doors of the house behind him would grow up knowing that no one had the right to decide her worth for her, because his own wife had proven, beyond any argument this county could still muster, that worth was never something to be assigned from outside at all, only something to be recognized, sooner or later, by anyone with the honesty to look properly. The applause that followed was not the qualified, half-hearted laughter that had once greeted Lady Marguerite's crueler wit. It rose from the whole lawn at once, tenant families and gentry together, genuine and sustained, until even Lady Prisca, standing near the back with her hands folded, was seen to clap along with everyone else, her expression. For once, entirely without irony, Wren did not go up to the platform. She stood where she was, at the edge of the crowd, exactly the vantage point she had occupied her whole life, and found, for the first time she could remember, that standing at the edge no longer felt like exile, only like the place from which she had always seen the truest picture of the room, and that the room, at last, had turned to look back. She was always worth believing in. The truth of it was, long before anyone troubled themselves to test it, and the tragedy of her early years had never been a lack of worth at all, only a world too careless or too comfortable to look for it in a girl who did not announce herself loudly enough to be noticed. It was not a perfect marriage that had been built out of that overheard verdict and that forged letter and that storm-soaked confession. There were still mornings when old wounds ached faintly, still evenings when the memory of being doubted rose unbidden and had to be set down again with the same patient hand she had once used on torn hems, still disagreements and small failures of understanding that no triadic speech on a summer lawn could entirely dissolve. It was not easy and had never once claimed to be, but it was shared, fully and without reservation, by two people who had each, in their own slow and separate ways, learned to stop mistaking usefulness for the whole of a person's value, and simply shared was, in the end, more than enough. That evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the new building stood quiet and lamplit against the last gold light of the day, Wren and the Duke walked the long way back along the drive, where, 3 years before, a storm had once made the road nearly impassable, and where now the sky above them was the clean, rinsed blue of dawn arriving early after a night that had, for once, held no rain at all. He took her hand as they walked, the same way he had taken it in her mother's parlor, open and unhurried, and this time she did not have to decide whether to let him. Because the deciding had already been done, quietly, over 3 long years of small proofs offered and accepted, and their fingers stayed joined the whole way back to the house, past the mended gate and the well-kept gardens and the lit windows of the school that would carry her name, in one form or another, long after either of them had need of the ledgers that had first brought them together. 2 hands closed around each other in the fading light, walking without hurry toward whatever the rest of their shared and imperfect and entirely sufficient life still had left to. Give them,